So I want to welcome you all here. I'm Dr. Rhonda. That's what folks call me on campus. My mama named me Rhonda. Rhonda Y. Williams. I'm a professor here at Case Western Reserve University in the history department. I teach American, African American history, social justice issues, urban studies. This semester I'm teaching Intro to Black Studies. I'm also the founder and director of the Social Justice Institute. And tonight is a part of a series of events that the Social Justice Institute is putting on in co-sponsorship with Afro-AM, Afro-American Society, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, and OIDIO, the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity here at Case Western Reserve University. And we are putting this series of read-ins and teach-ins from conversation to action based on response and demand from those who came to our event at the end of last semester from Ferguson to Cleveland. And at the end of that event, which drew about, 150 or so people, at the end of that event, and we'll ask you also to fill out a form, we asked people, what do you need to know? What do you want to know? What do you want to learn more about to really kind of understand what's quote unquote busting loose or exposing itself in a different kind of way, or is more publicly in the forefront in Cleveland in terms of the issues around police community relations, around police accountability, around race, around racial inequality, around questions around economic inequality, white supremacy, all those words sometimes that we don't want to use but are part of the whole dialectic in trying to really understand what's going on in the city of Cleveland and going on around the nation as well. And one of the things that people asked for was some sessions on police brutality in the Black community. They asked for sessions on race, Cleveland, and social movement. So we did that on Saturday. We had a launch on Saturday of the social justice teach-ins. And so we had a session on that, and also nonviolent action preparation, as Joe Worthy calls it, as opposed to training, where he actually really walked us through what does it mean to really think about nonviolent action as a practice and as a philosophy, and how do those things really help us think about how we're engaged in community. And so we're going to get him to come back and do a part 2 to that as well. We will also, this is the second of the teach-ins, so we will have 2 more every other Wednesday following this Wednesday. So the next one will be March 4th. And the one after that will be March 18th. And we have flyers up here on the front table for you to learn more about those, as well as other things that the Institute is doing. So this is really, coming out of a kind of groundswell of people asking for more information and people being involved and invested in community, and people really trying to understand and learn more about what's going on. And one of the things that we did to really launch the whole thing was we did a DOJ findings report read-in, which is Department of Justice findings report read-in, and we did that on January 22nd. What we found is that there are many people who are actually organizing around and against police violence and police brutality, around the deaths that have occurred in our midst here in Cleveland and across the nation. But particularly here in Cleveland, they have not read the Department of Justice findings report, even though they're organizing around things that are in the Department of Justice findings report. And so we actually did a read-in to really let people know what's in that report and how could people begin to think about it, connect to it, and also begin to investigate it more so they know how to plug in to the different activities and actions that are happening in the city. And so at some point, we may repeat that as well, but we already have a full plate, and we're trying to respond to what people are asking for. So with that as the preface, I want to then now move into just a few quotes by James Baldwin. James Baldwin is my muse, and many people have probably heard of James Baldwin. Then I'm going to introduce Dr. Ronnie Dunn. He's going to take it away. He's awesome, Dr. Ronnie Dunn, in terms of the research that he's done, the way he's been engaged and invested in community, and the kinds of activism and action that he's involved in right now. So I think you're really open to a great treat. But I just want to give you a few quotes from James Baldwin just to think about and to ponder and to frame everything that I just said as fast as I talk, because I'm trying to get to Dr. Ronnie Dunn and not take up too much of the floor. James Baldwin, here are 3 quotes to kind of really think about. American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. So I want us to kind of ponder that as we think about the moment we're in and how it's connected to the past and why history is important. The second quote is this, in the parlance of the 1960s, early 1960s. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. And then the third quote is, precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience, okay? Precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience, you must find yourself at war with your society. So I kind of want us to think about those three quotes as we move into Dr. Dunn's presentation. Dr. Dunn is going to be talking to us about police brutality and the Black community. Dr. Dunn received his PhD in urban studies from CSU in 2004. He focuses on topics of racial and social justice, crime and the criminal justice system, policing and diversity issues, particularly those affecting minorities and the urban poor. He is currently the chair for the Commission for the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority. He is a member for Citizens for a Safe and Fair Cleveland, and he may talk a little bit about that, or you can ask him more about that later, but they really had actual policy impact and transformation in Cleveland in terms of disparate policing and outcomes and criminal justice solutions around crack and nonviolent felony offenses and those kinds of things. So he's really not only a scholar, I want to emphasize that, but a policy wonk and an empirical person, but he's actually in the midst of it, really trying to transform the conditions in society. He is also now a founding member of the Collaborative for a Safe, Fair, and Just Cleveland, which I'm also a part of as well. He has been appointed to the Governor's Task Force on Police and Community Relations, and he was just recently tapped by President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing to provide testimony on how to strengthen public trust and foster strong relationships between law enforcement and the communities they are supposed to protect and serve, and thereby reduce crime and create a more safe and secure environment. So with that, please welcome Dr. Ronnie Dunn for the presentation this evening.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rhonda, for that very gracious introduction. It's an honor to be here tonight. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out, fighting this cold weather. That says something about your dedication and commitment to these issues. Dr. Rhonda, I want to thank you for putting on this forum and giving me the opportunity to come and engage with the community in this setting. I'd like to start with a quote as well, a quote that Dr. Martin Luther King gave to the American Psychological Association 7 months before his assassination. Dr. King stated that America needs to understand that it is poisoned to its soul by racism, and the understanding needs to be carefully documented and consequently more difficult to reject. White America has an appalling lack of knowledge of the reality of Negro life, and Negroes want the social scientists to tell it like it is. I take that as my charge as a social scientist. Dr. Rhonda mentioned the way I approach issues relative to racial and social justice. And the thing that my mentor always stressed, stick with the data, stick with the data, be empirical. I see an old friend back here in the back, Cedric. He and I, we formed an organization, the Million Man March Association, back in '95. And I recall having to take a hiatus from that organization and the activism work we were doing to complete my education. One thing I heard the activists always saying, this rhetoric, we've got to be scientific, we've got to be scientific. So I was a returning veteran, returning from the military and returning to school, and I said, well, let me do just that, literally, be scientific about it. So getting the science to help address these issues impacting our communities and society. So with that being said, okay. W.E.B. Du Bois stated at the turn of the 20th century that the major problem confronting America during that century would be the problem of the color line. recent events would indicate that that is still the case. When we look at the number of unarmed citizens of color, particularly African Americans, that have died not only across the nation but here locally, with the recent deaths of Tamir Rice, Tanisha Anderson, and 2 years ago, Timothy Williams and Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams. Sociologist Eric Luna states that interactions with police become race-making situations, constructing what it means to be black, namely second-class citizens, constantly under surveillance and subject to abusive law enforcement. Sam Walker, one of the foremost authorities on police accountability and also a Cleveland Heights native, emeritus professor at the University of Nebraska, states that poor people of color bear the brunt of police abuse, which is one of the most volatile aspects of the national crisis of race crisis. Now note, he stated that in 2001, so here we are 14 years later, and we've really reached a tipping point in regards to police-community relations. I have to say, this next point, I note that incidents involving racial bias, abuse, and unnecessary use of force are stemming from police are likely to increase when we consider the demographic changes that are taking place in our society. As we're becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, I suggest that incidents relative to bias are likely to increase. Now, I must say, in light of where we are at this moment and this space in our nation's history, I think we've reached a tipping point. I don't think things will ever go back to the way they were. So I think we're in for, I'm cautiously optimistic that we are in for substantive change. And a lot of you young people give me that optimism with your activism and your energy around these issues. In order to understand where we are in this current moment, we have to first look at the relationship between the African American community and the police in its full social historical context. The roots of that relationship go all the way back to slavery, actually from the time Africans were brought here to the Americas. Race and space has always been, in recent history in the West, been used as a means of social control of blacks since the colonial period. And as early as 1690, South Carolina enacted a policing function that required all persons under penalty of 40 shillings to arrest and chastise any slave found out of their home plantation without a proper ticket. So the earliest forms of racial profiling. By the mid-1700s, slave patrols or paddy rollers existed in all of the southern colonies. These paddy rollers or police patrols were comprised of poor young white males whose favorite sport was Negro catching, watching, whipping, and intimidating. This was the first distinctively American police system and the predecessor to modern policing, to the modern police force of today. Now, the US, in America, we adopted our policing model from that of Britain, the watchman constable model. In the North, the early police primarily served the interests of the industrial elite to help quell labor unrest. But in the South, the predecessors of police forces were actually the paddy rollers. In 1837, the city of Charleston had the largest police force in the US with their slave patrol, 100-man slave patrol. Police were the principal agents of the violent oppression and repression of blacks throughout the Jim Crow era. From during the Gilded Age, the Roaring Twenties, from 1920 to 1932, over half of all blacks that were killed by whites were killed by police. The police were implicated in over 6,000 lynchings of blacks that occurred from Reconstruction up until the 60s, to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Blacks have long complained of abuse at the hands of police, as noted in the Kerner Commission report, which investigated the cause of the racial riots of the mid and late 60s and found the precipitating event that led to the majority of those urban riots of the late 60s was an interaction of abuse from between a white police officer and a black citizen. And despite the Kerner Commission's findings, these issues have remained relatively dormant in the public and national conscious and on the agenda until these occasional high-profile cases, such as the recent events in Ferguson, New York, and here in Cleveland as well, the killing of unarmed citizens of color. And we know there's been a consistent proliferation of these type of events since the 90s at least, with the Rodney King incident. That has kind of brought these issues to the forefront, and they bubble up from time to time, and then we regress back to the mean, and things go forward as normal until the next incident. During the period of the Great Migration, prior to the 1950s, the majority of the black population was still lived in the South. But by 1950, the majority of blacks were no longer in the rural South. They had migrated to the urban North, the Midwest, and the West, California and West. With that, police violence, as we well know, police were complicit in the oppression of civil rights workers, as has been dramatized in the recent movie release, Selma. For those of you that have seen it, I'm sure you're all familiar with that history. And the director of the FBI, James Comey, just released a video. Actually, he had made a statement, and he was talking about how he keeps a memo on his desk that was signed by the Attorney General from J. Edgar Hoover, allowing him to wiretap Dr. King. And I say that in relation to the actions of COINTELPRO and how our government and the law enforcement entity in this country worked to oppress and undermine the social and civil and political progress of people of color, particularly African Americans in this instance. During the 60s, there were more than 100 race riots throughout the country from the mid to the late 60s. Once again, virtually every one of those urban riots took place during the 60s were immediately preceded by a police black citizen confrontation. The city of Cleveland, we had 2 riots in our history. In 1966, the Huff riots. That stemmed from an incident at a bar over, I think it was on 79th, if I'm not mistaken, and that led to 4 days and 4 nights of rioting. The National Guard came in. I can't recall exactly how many fatalities stemmed from that particular incident or uprising, but millions of dollars in property damage, some of which is just now being reclaimed and revitalized in the Huff area. And then in 1968, we had the Glenville riots. My bearings are a little off, but Glenville is, yes, the next community over from where we are here at Case. there were, I think, 4 days of riots. No, Huff was longer, 4 days of riots with the Glenville riot. And it started with a shootout between the black nationalists and the police. And, pardon? Was there? Oh, I thought someone had a comment. And in the intervening year, something happened. Does anyone have any idea what I'm referring to that was of significance, of note? Eva?
The two riots?
Yes, in '67. What noteworthy event that put Cleveland on the map occurred in '67?
Stokes?
Yes, the election of Carl Stokes as the first African-American mayor of a major U.S. city. Now, Carl Stokes acknowledged in his biography that his candidacy was predicated in part on the support that he got from the business community, the white business community, that saw him as an insurance policy against future racial unrest. Well, obviously, that policy didn't pay off because we had the Glenville riots the next year. But it also speaks to the progressive nature of not only Cleveland at the time, but the African American community in this city during the '60s. I was on a panel Monday talking about the civil rights movement in Cleveland, and I was sharing how in 1998 I went to a conference in Chicago, the Black Radical Congress, and at that conference, I had breakfast with Kathleen Cleaver, Angela Davis, you name it. And that's where I first heard of Reverend Jeremiah Wright. I attended a panel session where he, Cornel West, and Eric Michael Dyson. You talk about heavy. That was a heavy session, okay? But the reaction, there were 6 of us from Cleveland that drove up to Chicago for that conference. And the way people responded and reacted to us when we told them we were from Cleveland, they were like in awe. They said, "Oh, you all have it going on." And we looked at each other like, what are they talking about? They were thinking about back in the day, you see. And I say that to say at the time in the 60s and 70s, Cleveland was, and the African American community was very, very progressive. I argue one of the most progressive, if not the, in the country. But since that time now, my critique is it's been one of, if not the most regressive. And I say that when you look at the social conditions that exist in this city, having leadership, African American leadership at the highest levels of government, yet and still, when you look at some of the inequities and disparities that exist, it's unconscionable. Yes.
I do want to say this, to his credit, even though we went up in flames that summer, one of the reasons that Cleveland was not in flames the day that Dr. King was assassinated was because Carl Stokes was in the streets. And all of the leaders in Cleveland actually took to the streets. I was this big, but I can see it like it was yesterday.
Yeah.
All of the leadership in Cleveland actually marched in the streets to make sure that the city did not go up in flames on April the 4th, 5th, and 6th.
You're absolutely right. And actually, I think it was was it the Glenville? No. It might have been when Dr. King was assassinated, he put out an order for all white officers to stay out of the community, okay? Now that was quite controversial. He caught a lot of flack for that, but that is something of note that he did as well. So, I have a whole, I could write a book on my thoughts about Carl Stokes and the leadership in Cleveland subsequent to his time. But that's another subject for another day. But thank you for sharing that, Janice. Looking at the issue of race and the police and the use of force, Now, on average, the police kill approximately 400 persons per year are killed by the police on average. Now, I say on average because the data is really lacking in this area. There's not a comprehensive, rigorously collected data set or database to be obtained. The FBI, they have, in the Uniform Crime Report, they have the Supplemental Homicide Report that captures the data on citizens that have died as a result of deadly use of force by police. Out of the 17,000 police agencies in this nation, only 4% submit data on the use of deadly force against citizens annually to the FBI. And that's the most reliable data, if you will, that's available. So it's difficult to say precisely how frequently the police, one, kill citizens in general, but then being more specific, use deadly force and kill African Americans and citizens of color. Now, I do have some data, and I shared with Dr. Rhonda prior to the session that I had some statistics, and initially I had it in, but I didn't feel comfortable because I couldn't independently corroborate the data. So with that disclaimer, I will state what those figures suggest. It's indicated that between 2005 and 2012, the police on average killed 2 blacks per week during that time period. Now that data, once again, I haven't been able to independently corroborate that data, but it's further suggested that 50% of, well, 18% of African American, black males being slain make up 78% of this 400 victims annually. Now, once again, I couldn't independently corroborate this data. White officers, it indicates, killed black males, make 50% of those killings were by white officers, 36% by black officers. So that data should be taken with a grain of salt, okay? You can research it yourself, and I can give you the citations that I have, but I haven't been able to corroborate that. But once again, it's unfortunate that researchers, academics, we don't have the data to be able to determine exactly what the magnitude of this problem is. Now, in the letter that I wrote to the President's Task Force, the testimony, that was one of my recommendations, the required reporting, collection, and reporting of that data to the FBI. The Congress, back in 1994, they introduced a bill to require it, but it didn't go anywhere. And here we are, you know, some 20 some odd years later, and we still do not have that. Yes?
So the 400 is based upon the 4% reporting? So
Yes.
that's really just bogus, and that's not.
Pardon?
So that's used. So the 400 is based upon the 4%?
Yeah,
reporting?
from that, what data is
So
available.
that's not, so that's useless data then, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we know that number is not accurate. It is probably much higher. It obviously is much higher, but that's the most reliable. Yes.
Are you familiar with some of the efforts to crowdsource?
Pardon?
Are you familiar with some of the efforts to crowdsource better data collection? Killed by Police is one independent website, Facebook page that asks people to corroborate with local news
Yes.
stories. How are your feelings on their data?
Well, that's an ambitious effort, and once again, I guess the validity of that would be questionable because you're just asking people throughout the nation. There's a researcher, and his name is Kyle Wagner. You can Google him and read about his efforts to develop a database, a national database, to collect this data on use of force whenever the police fire their weapons, shoot at an individual. There are a lot of questions as to the variables that should go into it. Should it be anytime an officer fires his weapon, whether or not he shoots someone or not, and then those casualties that don't result in a fatality, and then also the fatality. But they're asking independent researchers to use, I think, Google Chrome to search news databases in their various localities for any reports on a daily basis for at least a year, I think, of any news reports of police homicides, police using deadly force in news reports. The thing is, there's too many there's not enough structure there to ensure the validity and reliability of that data, the data collection. Everybody might not adhere to the same research or method protocols. So, yes.
There are also efforts by a couple of lawyers' associations, most notably in New York, to document all cases of settlements for police brutality and police killings.
Yes.
And they're starting to release data and make databases available to researchers. I was wondering if you could comment on that too.
Well, I'm not as familiar with that. I know there are various efforts. I think that effort is primarily in the New York area, though. Yeah, so to have a national database, data set, that is what's really required. I mean, now, if I can go to the next slide, we know precisely how many police officers are killed in the line of duty. See, so why wouldn't they report the data on the number of citizens that are killed by police officers as a result of use of deadly force? So it's not asking a lot. You would think, I mean, it's almost unconscionable that they don't report that data and that it does not exist in a database. But see, as a researcher, and I'm sure you've all learned, if it's not documented, how can you tell? It doesn't exist almost. You see? The point is, if you don't have empirical data, then you don't know the magnitude of the problem. So, looking at the number of police that have died in the line of duty, this is the most recent data available. In 2011, there were 72 officers killed in the line of duty. 96% were males, 94% white males. Now, nationally, white police officers are about 75% of the police officers across the nation are white. As far as the assailants, 56% are whites. The assailants are white. 38% African American or black, 3% Native American, 1.3% Asian. So thus the majority of police are killed by white assailants, not blacks. Yet we have this pervasive fear, irrational fear of black males as the violent predator, if you will, that these officers have this irrational fear of. And we've heard that articulated time and again in some of these recent shootings. In Ferguson with Michael Brown, Officer Wilson stated how big he was, and he was like a monster, and he felt like a small child holding Hulk Hogan's arm. Well, Darren Wilson was 6'4" himself. So and I would argue, and research data would suggest this is as a result of the societal stereotype of African American males in our society as symbolic of the symbolic assailant. I teach another class, African American Images in Film, and I go all the way back to Birth of a Nation, which helped to establish and institutionalize many of the racial stereotypes of African Americans that are still with us today. But one character in that film specifically, Gus, he was the archetype of the brutal black buck. And that established that criminal image of the African American male in the American psyche. And he has proliferated and persisted throughout the 20th century, well into the 21st, in one form or another. Once again, as I stated, the lack of data and the data indicates that the majority of police officers are killed by white assailants. Yet, statistical data and a significant body of research show that racial and ethnic minorities, particularly black males, are disproportionately the victims of police shootings. And the research using computerized simulations of shoot, don't shoot threat scenarios show that the decision to use deadly force is made more frequently and quicker when the subject is black, whether they're armed or not, versus that of a white subject. And the decision to use deadly force is made much slower if the subject is white. And something struck me at the time of the Tremere Rice shooting. If you recall, does anyone recall the name Eric Friend? Eric Freem? He was the shooter, the survivalist over in Pennsylvania that had shot and 2 highway patrol officers, 2 state troopers, killing one. And then he was in the Poconos. They had a massive manhunt for 7 weeks. Well, immediately about that, a few days after the Tremere Rice shooting, they captured him. And I was struck by the fact that they, one, took him alive, and he only had a black eye when they took him into custody. Now, you know that he has killed a law enforcement officer, but yet they're able to bring him in alive. But yet we have these deaths of unarmed or African Americans or a 12-year-old with a BB gun, and yet we keep hearing this narrative about I was in fear for my life. Well, you know that this guy is out there, and he has already shown you that he will and is intent on killing police officers, yet they were able to take him alive. So that indicates there's something seriously wrong here. There's seriously something wrong. Once again, research in the field of social psychology suggests that there's this prevailing societal stereotype of minority males, particularly black males, as dangerous or violent, and they're referred to as what is known as the symbolic assailant in our society. Now, turning to the findings of the Department of Justice investigation. I want to bring this conversation a little closer to home. I don't know, by show of hands, how many have read the report? Okay, maybe half or so. Well, first of all, the findings. The DOJ conducted an 18-month investigation of the Cleveland Department of Police for They were investigating them for excessive use of force. And they did find a pattern or practice of unreasonable force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment being a protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Now, a seizure is any time the police stop you, detain you, or arrest you, you've been seized, okay? They also found a pattern of unnecessary and excessive use of deadly force, including shootings, head strikes, and impact weapons, the use of impact weapons. That can be the baton, the baton that the officers carry, flashlights, but there were some, in the report, they cited some cases of the use of the butt of the officer's service weapon. They, in essence, pistol whip individuals, some being in custody. Once they were already in handcuffs or under control, they then proceeded to use retaliatory force, which is the use, the second point, excessive or retaliatory use of less lethal force, including the use of tasers, chemical sprays, and fists. So in the research literature on policing, there's this concept called contempt of cop. Okay, so if you resist a police officer and challenge his authority, this is his way of you're in contempt of his authority. So he's going to then get retribution on you and punish you for that resistance. There was also a finding of excessive force against the mentally ill or those in crisis, including in calls for welfare checks. Now, this is what occurred in the case of Tanisha Anderson. Her loved ones called for assistance, an intervention, a welfare check for the police to come and help transport her to mental health facility, the hospital, if you will. And she died as a result of that. Can you imagine what those family members feel? The grief, the pain that they are feeling, knowing that they made that call, looking for the welfare of their loved one, and yet they're deceased as a result of them placing that call. There was also a finding of the use of poor and dangerous tactics that place the officers in a situation where it's unavoidable that they would use force. And that is dangerous both for the officer as well as the civilians. The Tremere Rice case immediately, that's the most clear example I can give of that. When the police approach what, from their perspective, given the information they had at the time, they were approaching an armed suspect, okay, because they weren't relayed the full detail of the caller, that was the information that was relayed to the 911 dispatcher was not properly relayed in its totality to the officers. So they thought they were approaching a potentially dangerous armed suspect, but that police cruiser pulled directly up upon Tremere within feet. That's a violation of proper protocol. I mean, the average citizen that watches police, any police show on TV knows that they should have kept a safe distance, 20 yards or so between themselves and that suspect, exited their vehicle and used that vehicle as a shield between themselves and that suspect, and then tried to disarm and de-escalate that situation, telling the suspect, put your hands up, get on the ground, things of that nature. But by that training officer pulling directly up on Tremere, placing that rookie officer within feet of him, now, they contend that they had given him 3 warnings to get your hands up, get your hands up, get your hands up. There's no way you can do that in 1.5 seconds. If you see that video immediately before that Officer Lohman is completely wrecked, he is fired. He is fired. So there's no way that they did give him a warning unless, as they contend, it was over the loudspeaker. Now, no one in that vicinity has reported hearing that statement, hearing that. But so that was a clear tactical error that created a situation wherein the use of deadly force was almost inevitable. So that speaks to training, once again, training. Obviously, there are severe training needs within the department. The structural deficiencies, there was a failure to adequately not only review, but first of all, to report, and then review and investigate instances or incidents of use of force, okay? The failure to fully and objectively investigate all misconduct allegations. Now, this is an area I'm very intimately aware of, and that I did a study of the Civilian Review Board in 2007, and that study was actually paid for by City Council. And I examined over 7 years worth of complaint data and surveyed over 186 former complainants. 19% of the respondents that I mailed out surveys to, out of 1,100, 19% responded. And overwhelmingly, they felt that the system was ineffective, and all of my review and analysis came to that very same conclusion. And in essence, that system is ineffective and is more symbolic than substantive. So therefore, once when the Attorney General released his report, and he noted systemic failures in the Cleveland Police Department, that was consistent with my earlier research, and that's also consistent with what DOJ has reported as well. So there's consistency there. There was also a failure to identify and respond to the patterns of at-risk behavior. Now, a citizen complaint process or system it should be used as an early warning system. That's a comprehensive database that identifies, it collects data on not only complaints, lawsuits against an officer, various performance indicators should go into there. Days off sick, various accidents, if a police officer has wrecked his cruiser, things of that nature. That can give you a more complete picture of that officer's performance and behavior, and be an early warning system as to potentially problem behavior before it escalates to the point that it results in a critical incident, such as an excessive or deadly use of force. But once again, the department was negligent in implementing the use of that system effectively as it should. And actually, their system was voluntary. You participate voluntarily. So that's totally antithetical to what the objective of a citizen complaint or early warning system is. Recommendations: 1, provide the officers with the necessary support, training, supervision, and equipment they need to do their jobs effectively and safely. I think we can all agree with that. They definitely need the resources and training. Adopt and enforce best practices. Look at other departments from around the nation and adopt those best practices. DOJ, every city they come into and implement, do a pattern and practice investigation and sign a consent decree, they implement the best practices at that time. So all we have to do, the way that the governor's task force was convened, that Dr. Williams noted I had been appointed to, Actually, that was my recommendation to Senator Nina Turner and State Senator Sandra Williams that we needed a statewide commission on policing in Ohio, due to the fact that the majority of our urban areas in the state have come under DOJ guidance. Columbus, Toledo, Cincinnati, Warren, Youngstown, you name it. And so that suggests it's not only a problem with policing here in Cleveland, Dayton, with Beaver Creek, the shooting of John Crawford out in Beaver Creek. So Steubenville was actually the first city to have a pattern and practice investigation done back in 1994. I met the attorney. He's been coming to the forums, the attorney that helped lead to the DOJ investigation in Steubenville. So that suggests there's a problem with policing across our state, not just here in Cleveland, okay? So those best practices, it's not some, best kept secret. They're readily available. But one thing I've observed about the Cleveland Police Department, they're resistant to outside oversight or input or recommendations. David Kennedy, he's a noted criminologist from John Jay College. He's at John Jay now. He was at Harvard when I first became aware of his work. He implemented a program in Boston in the mid to late 90s that resulted in what's been known as the Boston Miracle. It helped reduce homicides in Boston by 60% for about a 5-year period. And he took that model and has gone across the nation in various cities implementing it. Back in 2005, we had a shooting up on Kinsman where a homeowner shot and killed a 15-year-old youth that was attempting to rob him, and the homeowner had a CCW, a concealed carry weapon. I don't know if any of you recall that incident, but I was on Ideal Stream with Blaine Griffin, the Director of Community Relations, discussing that incident. And I recommended to Blaine that the city go to Boston, take a look at the Boston model, and they did. A group of 10 public law enforcement officials and city officials went up to Boston, brought David Kennedy back, and he did a couple of presentations, one over in Huff, one at City Hall, and they were resistant to implementing the program, that model, in the way that he suggested. Now, we brought him here with the task force. Our first forum was in January at CSU. They brought David Kennedy in as a speaker, and I asked him what happened. What happened when you came in before? And he was reluctant to answer candidly because of the political ramifications. But it was quite clear it was the resistance that he encountered here in the city to implementing, trying something new, something innovative. Also, it's recommended that they implement community policing strategies at all levels. Now, after the Tremere Rice shooting, Tremere was shot that Saturday. I was on Ideal Stream that Monday with Jeff Fulmer, the then president of the Cleveland Police Union, Cleveland Patrolmen's Police Union. And he was asked a question about community policing. And he said, yes, we have a unit, a community policing unit. And I interrupted. I said, that's the problem right there. Community policing is a philosophy that should permeate that department. Officers should be immersed in community policing strategies and philosophy from the time they enter the academy. It shouldn't be something that's assigned to a particular unit or a number of officers. every officer should have a community policing orientation. So therein lies much of the problem right there. Now, as many of you that have read the DOJ report undoubtedly observed, the report is silent on the issue of race. And many of us were quite critical of that. How can you do a thorough investigation of policing in this city, a majority African American city that has the history of police misconduct that this city has, and not deal with the issue of race? Well, they did acknowledge that that oversight or weakness in the report, but they gave a reason as to why they didn't. I mean, it is what it is, but they did indicate that race can still be addressed in the consent decree process, but they need to hear that that's an issue from the community. They need to hear it as a salient theme in the recommendations that are put forward. So I'm going to now briefly go into some of my research that I've done on the issue of race and racial profiling in particular. And the reason I focus on racial profiling, and particularly in the context of traffic enforcement and traffic stops, the most frequent contact that the average citizen has with police comes through a traffic stop. I was in a diversity training session with 19 suburban police chiefs just this morning, all white, and they pretty much, I was just observing, but they stated this point, that the most frequent contact and potentially volatile encounter that a police officer is going to have with the citizen comes from executing a traffic stop. And the police are the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. So that's why I focus on the front. I do work, I've done research throughout the criminal justice continuum, but if we want to really address a lot of the disparities and inequities that exist in that system, we have to go to the beginning, go to the front. So that's why I focus on racial profiling. Racial profiling is defined as the use of race as a key factor in deciding whether or not to make a traffic stop, or in the context of stop and frisk, which we've heard so much about coming out of New York, pedestrian foot traffic. So me as an officer, I determine based on a person's race or ethnicity, I have a suspicion that they've committed some crime or something of that nature, and thus execute a stop. The police prefer the term bias policing. Now, on that point of the pedestrian stops and stop and frisk, once again, I want to make that point because I recently wrote an article that's going to be published, that's in the process of being published now, that some argue that stop and frisk is something different and aside from racial profiling. It's just racial profiling in another context. Racial profiling happens in many contexts, in airports, going through customs, in shopping centers, as you're going through the mall. So it's just racial profiling in the context of pedestrian traffic. Now, related to that issue, there are two precedent-setting cases that went before the U.S. Supreme Court that emanated out of actions emanating from incidents with the Cleveland Police Department. One is the Terry v. Ohio case, Terry v. Ohio. That resulted in what is known as the Terry frisk. In 1963, on the corner of 14th and Euclid, just one block from my office at CSU, an officer, John McFadden, stopped two African-American males, John Terry and Childen was the other gentleman's last name. He saw them at the corner pacing back and forth. He observed them for about 15 minutes, and he approached them and stopped them, identified himself as a police officer, and frisked them because he thought they were about to commit a robbery. Well, they were carrying weapons, and they ultimately they went to the Ohio Reformatory. They were sent to prison. Lou Stokes, Congressman Louis Stokes, he argued that case before the U.S. Supreme Court, in essence saying that they were profiled. They were racially profiled. That is why this officer approached them, and Officer McFadden stated on the stand, and I have the transcript, he says when asked what drew his attention to them, and he said, quote, "I didn't like them," meaning for the area. Now, this is downtown Cleveland, midday 1963, two black males, and he just assumed, okay, they're up to something suspicious. Their behavior obviously was suspicious, but so that was the argument that Congressman Stokes presented. Well, the ruling of the lower court was upheld. So in essence, they disavowed the argument and the ruling held. But from that, they helped define the parameters by which the police can now frisk an individual, and the practices used under stop and frisk emanated from that case. And there was another case, Ohio versus Mapp versus Ohio. Dolly Mapp, she just passed away in the past 2 months. That was a case where she was the girlfriend of Archie Moore, who was I think middleweight boxing champ at the time, and it had something to do with Don King. It's a very intriguing history behind all of this, and that's part of Cleveland's history. But the police went and searched her house, and they didn't have a warrant. Okay, and so that helped define the parameters around the admissibility of evidence obtained from an unlawful search. Both of those issues, those cases emanated out of the Cleveland Police Department. And in my book, I write about how that is part of the culture in that department as an institution. And those same practices are passed on generation through generation of law enforcement officers, if you know anything about organizational behavior and how difficult it is to root out certain behavior in an institution, particularly through informal policies and practices. And okay, anyway, getting back to this. The primary question underlying the research dealing with racial profiling is whether or not minorities are more heavily surveilled, stopped, detained, investigated, and ultimately sanctioned and processed into the criminal justice system by police than are whites. And I say that to say, when they issue you that traffic citation, you've formally been processed into the system. Now, if you're given a warning and let go, you've effectively been diverted from the system. Analyzing traffic ticketing data does not give us any insight into who's diverted from the system because there's no record. And then we have to ask, what's the race and ethnicity? The question is, are whites more likely to be given a warning versus being penalized with a traffic citation? This study was commissioned by former county prosecutor Bill Mason back in 2009 as a result of a series that the Plain Dealer ran noting the racial disparities in the county's criminal justice system relative to drug arrests and sentences. Now, Mason contended that, yes, these disparities exist. He couldn't argue against that. But he said that my office, the prosecutor's office, is not responsible for creating these disparities. we prosecute the cases that are presented to us. So what he decided, we need to take a look at the whole criminal justice system, which I agreed with. He was absolutely right. So what he did, he commissioned the University of Cincinnati to look at everything from arrest through sentencing, and myself and colleagues in the sociology department at CSU to look at the use of police discretion. So in order to do that, I replicated my earlier study on traffic ticketing patterns, or i.e. racial profiling. My colleagues, now in sociology, there's a tradition in research relative to policing of doing police ride-alongs. Now, myself and a colleague in urban that were part of the team, we questioned the validity of doing ride-alongs with police if you're investigating racial bias. How likely is it they're going to exhibit biased behavior if you're sitting there riding along with them? But needless to say, we left them to their own devices, and I did my study. Now, my study included the city of Cleveland and 3 suburban jurisdictions. Only 3 were willing to participate or cooperate, so I do commend them for their willingness to. Many cities, some that I was somewhat taken aback by, refused to participate, to cooperate. The cities that did take part in the study were obviously Cleveland, Shaker Heights, Brook Park, and Westlake. Now, they were selected based on their racial and socioeconomic demographics, with Cleveland and Shaker representing 2 racially diverse communities, and then Brook Park and Westlake representing 2 predominantly white suburbs at different ends of the income spectrum. Shaker and Westlake, more affluent. Brook Park, although their socioeconomics level is higher than Cleveland, they were the most comparable city to Cleveland. So, but Brook Park representing a lower SES. And in order to analyze the data, I obtained what's known as a gravity model. A gravity model is used by transportation planners to determine infrastructure needs. For example, with the building of the Interbelt Bridge, they would use, or they have used, transportation gravity models to determine the volume of traffic those spans of that bridge need to be able to accommodate. I obtained the gravity model from NOACA, that's the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency on 13th and Superior. And I then took 2010 racial demographic and age census data and imputed that into the gravity model. Now, Cleveland draws its driving population from a 13-county region. The majority of people of color, African Americans and other minorities, are within Cuyahoga County. Those other 12 outlying counties have less than 1% of Black or other minority populations. And I also obtained databases, traffic ticketing databases from each of the jurisdictions, and analyzed that data then by race. But going back to the gravity model, I measured the driving age population, with the driving age being 15 is the youngest at which you can legally drive in the state of Ohio, with the driver's permit, 85 the upper end of the threshold, where the data, the literature indicates there's a significant decline of people driving at that age. Now, we all know people older than 85 that are still driving, but there is a considerable decline after that age. And I calculated proportional share and likelihood ratios for each of the jurisdictions and each racial group. So here we see for the city of Cleveland, Cleveland's driving population in a 24-hour period is more than 3.2 million motorists traversing our city streets. Of that, whites represented 54.6% of the driving population, blacks 38.4%, other minorities 6.9%. In Brook Park, a driving population of 191,711 motorists, whites were 78.8%, blacks 16.2%, other minorities 5%. Shaker Heights, driving population 221,502, whites 58.1%, blacks 35.3%, other minorities 6.6%. Westlake, driving population 399,163, of which 83.4% were white, 11% black, 5.5% other minorities. I only included the data for the cities that had significant racial disparities. Those cities were Cleveland and Shaker Heights. I wasn't surprised at all by Cleveland. Actually, I did my initial study, my dissertation on the city of Cleveland in 2004, and the numbers have gotten worse rather than better in Cleveland. Now, many of you might be surprised to find out the infamous traffic cameras that were recently overturned, those were actually a recommendation from my dissertation to address the racial bias found in the ticketing data at that time. Okay, not to generate revenue, as all of the talking heads and the politicians were cited. That was really the objective, and I write about how the administration got wind of my research and how it went from research to policy, but that's another story. So here in the city of Cleveland, these are only traffic tickets administered by officers, not the traffic camera ticketing data. This is for 2009. There were 83,123 traffic tickets written in that year by officers. Blacks, once again, were 38.4% of the driving population, received 59% of the traffic tickets. This is their proportional share of tickets. One would be what we would expect to find, all else being equal. So blacks were 53%, they were ticketed at 53% more than what we would expect, giving their percentage of the driving population, all else being equal. They were 2.5 times as likely to be ticketed by police as were white motorists. Whites, on the other hand, were 54.6% of the driving population, received 33% of the traffic tickets. That's 60% or 40% below what we would expect, given their proportional share. And other minorities were 6.9% of the driving population, received 7.5% of the tickets. This is 8 percentage points above what we would expect. They were 1.8 times as likely to be ticketed in Cleveland as were whites. Looking at Shaker, now this did surprise me, the findings in Shaker. There were 12,089 tickets administered in that year. Blacks were 35% of the driving population, received 62% of the tickets. That's 76% above what we would expect, given their percentage of the driving population. They were 2.86 times as likely to be ticketed as were white motorists, so almost 3 times as likely. Whites, on the other hand, 58% of the driving population, only received 36% of the tickets. This is 62% of their proportional share, so 38% less than what we would expect. And relative to blacks, using blacks as a reference group, whites were 35% as likely to be ticketed as were blacks in Shaker. And looking at other minorities, they were 7% of the driving population, received 2% of the tickets. That's only 35% of their proportional share. They were 58% as likely to be ticketed as were whites, 20% as likely as blacks. Now, speeding was the most frequent traffic citation in all 4 jurisdictions, and whites were the majority of speeders in all 4 jurisdictions. Speeding is the most obvious easily recognized traffic offense, with the exception maybe of DWI, driving under the influence and noticing a car swerving. So it's most readily observed by police, is my point. Whites were the majority. In Cleveland, speeding violations were 19.5% of the citations. In Shaker, they were 27%. Whites were 47% of the speeders in Cleveland, 55% in Shaker. Seatbelt and driving under suspension were the second and third most frequent citations in both of these jurisdictions. Both of these violations are non-moving violations. Now, I want you to think, at what point during a traffic stop or an encounter can the police determine, one, that a motorist is not wearing their seatbelt? Anyone want to venture an answer? After the stop has been made, as he's approaching your vehicle, right? It's difficult to tell someone isn't wearing a seatbelt from a distance. So, and secondly, driving under suspension. I actually queried two police executives, one a police chief, the other a commander, about this data to get their interpretation of it. And I asked them, at what point, how can the police determine a motorist's license are suspended? They said, well, one of two ways. Either by calling in for a radio check, executing what they call a rolling check, calling the dispatcher, or running their plates using the mobile data terminal, the onboard computer in their car. And I'm sure we've all seen the police tapping out someone's license plate at a red light or what have you. So the question then becomes, what was the reason for the traffic stop or running of the plates in the first place? Okay? And in Ohio, a seatbelt violation is a secondary offense, meaning the police have to stop you for something else in order to write you a citation for the seatbelt violation. Now, South Euclid and a few, I think one or two other jurisdictions have just made seatbelt violations a primary offense, so the police can write you a ticket solely for not wearing a seatbelt. But once again, it's hard to detect. I'm going to come back to this point. Blacks were the majority of each of those types of citations. In Cleveland, they were 61% of those cited for seatbelt violations, 79% of those cited for driving under suspension. In Shaker, they were 83% of those cited for seatbelt violations. In Shaker, they were 92% of those cited for driving under suspension. And looking at seatbelts in Cleveland, a black had a 2.77 times chance in comparison to whites to being cited for a seatbelt violation. They were 9.87 times as likely to be cited for a seatbelt violation as whites in Shaker. For driving under suspension in Cleveland, blacks were 7.63 times as likely to be cited as were whites. In Shaker, they were 26.2 times as likely to be cited for driving under suspension. Now, I want you to think about something. There were two cases recently. A couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the Plain Dealer about the newly elected county executive, Armin Budish. And Armin Budish was in jeopardy of having his license suspended because he had 12 points on his driver's license. Well, he was able to avoid that penalty. And if we all, I'm sure, are pretty familiar with what happened with his predecessor, Ed Fitzgerald, county executive, the prior county executive. He ran for governor against Governor Kasich, and his campaign pretty much imploded when it came to light. He had been driving for 10 years without a valid driver's license. So when I read that, I'm saying, whoa, wait a minute, where are the chances? If they were black, would they have been able to drive that long under those conditions? No. No, it would have come to light much earlier. Now, let me make this point. Those statistics that I just cited, the blacks being 92% of those cited for driving under suspension and 79% for seatbelt violation, that's statistically improbable that that is the result of random chance. It's less than 1% probability that you would get those results from random chance, okay? So that indicates that the high driving under suspension rate is a clear indication that the police are specifically targeting black motorists. They're running their plates, and then they're operating under what's known as expectancy theory, being if I run the plates of a black motorist, chances are I'm more likely to get a want, a warrant, or some type of legal encumberment back that will then justify me executing further police actions, investigating them, in essence, using a pretextual stop to search their car or their person or both for drugs, guns, or some other type of contraband. What are the consequences of this practice? Some are obvious, some are less obvious. One of the more obvious, well, maybe not so, is the increased likelihood of a potentially volatile incident occurring, potentially a use of force incident. There was just an article, was today, Wednesday, I think in Monday's paper, a case was just allowed to proceed of a young man that was killed by police as a result of a traffic incident here, a traffic stop in the city. Rodney Brown was his name. And at first, I guess the case had been thrown out. Well, on appeal, the judge said there was enough evidence for the case to go forward, so it's been reinstated. But, and as I pointed out this morning, I was in that training with those police chiefs, and they clearly said, a traffic stop is the most volatile, uncertain situation that a police officer can be put in. So it's also uncertainty, and it's fraught with, uncertainty on both sides, because as a motorist, we become apprehensive, anxious, everything of that nature, fearful, and sometimes, and this morning, they used a video clip to show an incident, a traffic stop, or actually the officer was reporting to an accident in Shaker. African-American male, his car had hit a patch of ice and slid into a tree. And the officer, you could hear him on his video dash cam, he was already escalating the situation before he even got out of his vehicle. He's like, what the F? And, as he's approaching, and he gets out and, what are you doing? That's how he approached the guy. Now, the guy is there on the phone. He smacked into this tree and everything, and all of the officers agreed the guy escalated the situation from the very beginning. The officer did. And the guy, the young black male, he had just lost a family member, and he had a CCW license, so he had a gun on him, and but the whole thing went south real quickly. It went bad. So the point is, by disproportionately stopping African Americans, they create a condition or a situation that can have a less than desirable outcome. It also increases their contact with the criminal justice system. It's a violation of citizens' 4th and 14th Amendments, the 14th Amendment being equal protection under the law. We're being treated differently by the police and not being afforded the same constitutional rights and protections as others. It perpetuates this adversarial police-community relations that exist between our community and the police. And the facilitator this morning, he was astute enough to know that when that young man left that encounter and went to the gathering with his family, he shared that experience. And that permeates throughout our family, our neighborhood, every African American likely has, if not personally, a negative encounter or story a family member, a neighbor, someone has. And that is what helps perpetuate this distrust and negative interaction and relationship between our community and the police. Yes?
It's not justified that police officers conduct themselves in such a manner, but how doesn't it make sense that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, being instigative and being more apprehensive towards the young African male that was smacked into the tree? If you don't control your own economics in your community, and you don't, police are people that actually control the community that they live in. So since that's not happening, why shouldn't police officers act that way? Doesn't it not make sense?
Well, no, it doesn't. We have a constitution. We are citizens of this country. That's what the 4th and 14th Amendment are about. That's what the Constitution is about. So constitutionally, I understand your point, but I think that's a different discussion and a different argument. My view is no, it doesn't. It's not justified that they would treat them that way. There should be equal treatment, equitable, just treatment.
Second thing is that out of all the different census and the demographics of different communities and different areas, where is the scope or the scale to deal with addiction?
To deal with
addiction.
Addiction?
I mean, not speaking of, usually when people speak of addiction, it's usually relating to drugs, but there's a lot of other more addictions than relating to drugs. I mean, because not everybody that eats food becomes a food addict, or not everybody drinks a glass of wine becomes an alcoholic. But addiction, a lot of people have addiction of power, such as officers.
Okay.
Corporations that must own more and more powers. Nothing is never enough for them.
Yes.
So if you're not dealing with addiction, I mean,
well, you raise a very, very interesting point. Another observation I've been making, talking about addiction, for years, and these practices that I'm illuminating here, these are part of the war on drug regime. I argue there's been some reforms on the back end of the criminal justice continuum. We've seen a lot of, the governor signed a collateral sanctions bill to deal with reentry, to remove some of the barriers for reentry. So for returning citizens coming back into our community. Now, mind you, we incarcerate more of our citizens than any other nation on the face of this earth. More than 2.2 million citizens have been incarcerated and are incarcerated in this country. And that has increased exponentially over the past 30 years under this war on drugs. I think it's been almost a 300% increase in our nation's prison population from the 1970s to where we are today, okay? And that's been primarily people of color. Okay. Now, also, there's been reform, not equaling, but a reduction of the sentencing disparity from crack to powder cocaine. We know there was a 100-to-1 with crack, supposedly, in the majority in popular culture or in the mainstream, we have this perception that crack was a black drug. Crack has never been a drug utilized more by blacks than whites. Each racial group uses drugs commensurate with their percentage of the population. Whites are 75% of the population and roughly 72% of the drug-using population. African Americans, 13%, roughly 14% of the drug-using population. Stay with me here. Now, look at the current drug epidemic we're under. Is it crack anymore? What's the the current drug epidemic we're encountering? Heroin. Who is that impacting? Is it the inner city? No, it's suburbanites, whites. So you raise a good point when you talk about addiction. Now, are we criminalizing and incarcerating these white heroin addicts the way we were black crack addicts or drug addicts? Dr. Rhonda mentioned one of the policy reforms that myself and some colleagues were engaged in back in 2009. I mentioned the study that Bill Mason commissioned. This study was commissioned as a result of some of that advocacy work that we did. We gave the PD a study that had been commissioned by the ACLU that showed the racial disparities in drug sentencing. We petitioned all of the elected officials, the mayor, the then 3 county commissioners, the prosecutor's office for over a year. We advocated around that research. Nobody would do anything. We gave the research to the PD. They did their series. After that, then everybody wanted to take action, to do something. What it was, the city of Cleveland was the only city in the state to prosecute possession of a crack pipe with a minuscule amount of drug residue in it as a felony, okay? Now, when the city agreed to overturn that policy, we were down at City Hall in the Red Room. The mayor and his administrative staff were all around. And then Safety Director Martin Flass said, "We've been following a failed drug policy for 23 years. Now, in my research leading up to this study, we had asked, and the advocacy work we were doing, we had asked Bill Mason, how many of these cases do you average a year? He said between 12 to 1,500 cases a year. Now think about it. Do the math. Over 23 years, that's more than 32,000 people that were saddled with felony drug convictions for possession of a crack pipe. Now, for those of you that don't know, if I have a crack pipe, what am I? Am I a major drug dealer? No, I'm a drug addict. I have a problem, a mental health problem. And my point is, that's the approach that we see is being taken now, that other communities are being impacted by a drug epidemic. It's treatment versus incarceration. You know, when you even hear the way all of the policies have been changed and the resources thrown at treatment, and I'm not suggesting that they should penalize and incarcerate whites because it's impacting their community the way they did. No, it was failed drug policies that we followed for 30 years. But let's not act like, you know, we've got blinders on like that didn't happen. We've damaged these people's lives. Do you know how difficult it is to get a job with a felony? And see, that's detrimental not only to that individual and their families, that helps create recidivism, because if I can't get a job, I'm left to my vices, right? I'm almost compelled to go back to it, and I'll come back to you. I want to finish this up, and then we can continue this dialogue, okay? Because this kind of relates to the conversation that we're having right now, some of these penalties. I mentioned the adversarial police community relations. Then there's the financial cost, the financial burden. There's the obvious fine of the cost of the citation itself. Then there's some hidden costs. If you decide you want to go to court to fight this citation, you might have to pay court costs, time off work if you're fortunate enough to be working, increased insurance costs. For every moving violation in the state of Ohio, you get between 2 and 4 points on your driver's license. As I stated earlier, if you get 12 points in the 2-year period, your license are suspended. Now, I gave this presentation to the Jewish Federation about a month ago. And when I got to this point, I mentioned Armin Budish, okay, what I shared with you about the current county executive. And I'm in a room full of, you know, Jewish people, about 40 or so, and I see everybody pointing over to the opposite side of the room, and I look, and there's this little lady holding up her name tag. It said Amy Budish. That was Armin's wife. So, it's like, okay, we all got a good laugh out of it, and I told her, no offense meant, but see, her husband, he is an attorney. He's now the county executive. He was the Speaker of the House in the state legislature. He had resources. He was able to maneuver to avoid having his license suspended. But think about the impact that would have on any of us if we lost our driver's license for a year. Okay, what impact would that have not only on us, but our family, our livelihood, okay? And then think about the percentage of blacks in Cleveland, 79%. And I also include, and I didn't put it in here, the arrest data as well. Blacks were the majority of those arrested, many of them as a result of driving under suspension. But guess what? You don't have to be arrested. An officer doesn't have to arrest you if you're driving under suspended license. You can have someone come take your car and drive it for you, just as they might do if you're caught driving drunk and they want to give you a break or something of that nature. But that's not the case. So they aren't giving blacks that benefit of the doubt or that discretion. So they're being caught up in this cycle. And this next point, it exacerbates an already precarious jobs-to-job skills mismatch that exists in the city and in urban areas like Cleveland when you think about the low educational attainment level in the city's schools graduation rate, 60%. What jobs are the jobs that many of the inner city residents are most qualified for, those that have low educational levels, those blue-collar, labor, manufacturing jobs that do still exist in the region, where are they located? In the suburbs, tucked away in some industrial park, right? So now I don't have driver's license. How do I get out there to the jobs I'm probably most qualified for? You see, so now it exacerbates my employability, my employment situation. So it just keeps snowballing. And I think we'll all acknowledge driving's a necessity, and obviously given those numbers, what people are doing are taking their chances of driving on those suspended license, but the police are so prolific at running their plates, they keep getting caught, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle that they're caught up in, okay? This, in turn, I argue, helps reinforce racial stereotypes. Go down to the Justice Center any day this week or next week, next month, next year, and what do you see? Predominantly low-income African Americans, Hispanics, and some poor whites, but disproportionately, overwhelmingly black, right? Well, that helps reinforce those racial stereotypes about the criminogenic nature of African Americans, which in turn help reinforce the justification for racial segregation or isolating ourselves, we're one of the most racially segregated cities in the country. We're always up there near the top, near that top 5, okay? And one last point. Overall, this is very adverse for the economy regionally. These people, it's impeding their employability, okay? So that's detrimental to the whole region economically. Okay, all right, let's see. Policy needs and initiatives. 1, push for racial profiling legislation at the local, county, and state level. I base this on several points. 1, Cleveland has the largest minority and African American population in the state, so what more logical place for such legislation to start than here in Cleveland? And this goes back to one of the earlier criticisms or critiques I made about the leadership in Cleveland and how it's one of the more regressive cities. We've got black leadership at the highest level. They've known about this data since my study in 2004 when they jumped on the traffic cameras. Why? They saw the revenue stream that was generated. And I argue, had Jane Campbell been an astute politician at the time, she would have introduced it at the reason that I intended, say, look, this is going to help address racial bias. It's an objective way of enforcing traffic laws, okay? That camera doesn't care what your race was, what your color, your socioeconomic background or status. You run that light, you speed, take the picture, right? Now, they politicized it with the placement of the cameras. That's a whole nother issue. But in and of itself, it was a purely objective mechanism to do that. All she had to do 6 months down the road, say, oh, look, by the way, we have this unexpected revenue stream. She'd still probably be mayor today, right? Mayor for life, maybe, like Marion Barry, you know? No, well, I'll save that. I almost made a comment about one of our councilmen, but I'll be good. I'll be good. And also, the point, looking at the data in Shaker, those statistics in Shaker, what is the characteristic or how is Shaker viewed as far as within the county? It's viewed as being one of the more tolerant, inclusive, diverse cities in the county, right? Well, if we find those type of disparities in Shaker, what are we likely to find in those suburbs that weren't willing to participate in the study? So that's my argument for doing something at the county level. And out of that encounter I had with Armin Budish's wife, she did tell him about my study, and we've been in communication, and he's going to try to arrange a meeting between he and I or his law enforcement staff and the new sheriff, who I happen to know, and see what can be done at the county level as well. And Ohio is one of 22 states that does not currently have any type of racial profiling legislation on our books. Now, once again, I'm on that state commission, so one thing you can be assured, I'm going to be pushing for legislation at the state level, and not only prohibiting the practice, but requiring the collection of demographic data on all stops, not just those that result in traffic tickets. And also, the incorporation of implicit bias research into the psychological testing, both in the hiring of police officers as well as their in-service training. And I raise that because, as I stated, I was at this training session this morning, and they show, we exhibited some of the racial implicit bias research. And the point is, just because we all have biases, we all have implicit or unconscious bias. Just because we do, I mean, it only makes sense, kind of going to your point, we're socialized in a racially stratified society. Now, this study, this test, the implicit association test, you can Google it and take it yourself. It was developed by Harvard psychologists over 20 years ago. So hundreds of thousands of people have probably taken it by now. 80% of all respondents that have taken it have a pro-white bias or anti-black pro-white bias. 50% of African Americans that take it have a pro-white bias. Now, I give that test every semester to my students, and it never fails. They always, you know, they're up in arms. They're, you know, when they get a result, particularly an African American that has a result that suggests that they're biased against blacks, you know. But it only makes sense when you think about how we're socialized and bombarded and immersed with these racialized cues hundreds and thousands of times a day. So when you look at it and read the research, it really makes sense. So I argue that needs to be incorporated into police hiring and training. And just because they show a bias, that wouldn't preclude them from being hired. The thing is, once you become conscious of that bias, then you can work to offset it so that it doesn't impact your decision-making and your actions. So this notion of us being colorblind, we need to get over that and just recognize we all carry some biases with us, but then acknowledging them and work to offset it. And lastly, requiring the reporting of civilians shot and killed by police to the FBI. We need a national database, national data on police use of deadly force. So with that, I thank you. I went a little long. Now I'd like to open it up for questions. Yes. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. I'll start over here. I'll come back over here. And yeah.
Well, thanks for the evidence.
Thank you.
I can't understand it.
Yeah.
What is this? Oh. It seems to me that the most glaring reform, if you really want to make a difference, that I don't see is a reform that says if you murder somebody, whether you're a cop or not, you're supposed to be brought up on murder charges. If you want to stop the police from murdering people, there's got to be consequences. No consequences. This has been going on ever since I've known. There's never been a time in this country when this hasn't been going on. The Black Panther Party suggested community control of the police. This is old. The police have no accountability. They're completely exonerated. Where is the reform that says if you shoot somebody, if you execute somebody on the street or in the jails, you're going up for murder? Where is that reform?
You're absolutely right. I agree with you wholeheartedly. As I indicated or alluded to, this is nothing new. You know, there's a long history of it. The thing is, hopefully, this will put the whole criminal justice system under review, some scrutiny. There are conversations about that happening here locally. I'm not at liberty to go into too much depth about it, but there are discussions about looking at the whole system once again. And this time, I hope that it's an earnest and thorough effort to do that. I don't know.
The only time they ever get brought up is if there's a protest in the street, and then almost never.
Yes, well, and that's why, as I stated at the outset, I'm very optimistic that this time might be different because the young people and the way they are taking it to the streets. We've been kind of complacent and lulled to sleep, my generation and earlier generations. I think we thought, many thought they'd arrived, okay? When the doors and opportunities of the civil rights movement and opportunities opened up, many fled the inner cities, didn't look back. We've got a lot of issues, a lot of problems on both sides, but it's going to take a community response, not only from the African American community, as Dr. Rhonda, I'm sure, has taught in her classes. We've always had allies. We wouldn't have been able to do any of the progressive achievements that have been made in this country have been multiracial initiatives and campaigns. So once again, it's going to take all segments of our society to make the necessary changes now. And the thing is, we have to also look at what's happening here in the U.S., look at it in a global, international context. We see what's happening over in the Middle East. Think about it. What's the most, what groups, who is it that ISIS, if you will, are recruiting? Who are they targeting? The alienated, the disenchanted, disenfranchised, right? What group in our society is more marginalized and alienated and disenchanted than the young black male? So we need to really heed where we are, take a look at where we are at this point in our history.
I was just wondering if you can elaborate on the Boston Miracle initiative that David Kennedy started, because I recently heard an interview with Michelle Alexander, and they talked about David Kennedy, and he made a statement that basically said the idea that racial profiling and biases being the issue with the policing and communities is a lie. Like, you know, I've worked with these policemen and policewomen, and it's clearly that's not the problem. So it goes back to also your statement, like, well, I can't be with the police and really think they're not going to be biased or not show their biases. So yeah, so can you just elaborate on the Boston Miracle? Then also, like, how do you feel that, how is that effective with David Kennedy's ideas that he has towards that?
Yes, thank you. Now, mind you, I had recommended that they bring David Kennedy to town and look at the Boston Miracle. That was in 2005. As I stated, he was here January 21st at Cleveland State. And he made a statement, and he made reference to Michelle Alexander's work. And I was taken aback and dismayed by his comments and they publicized it in the PD the next day, and he basically diminished the significance of race and what's going on. And I question now, mind you, I'm on the task force, but that was our first forum, and I didn't really have any input into the speakers that they brought in. So initially when they brought him in, I thought, okay, cool, David Kennedy, I know of his work. I'm thinking back to what he had done in Boston. He has since changed his position, and his comments were in line with what you just suggested. And I'm thinking he blew it right there. So, you know, I raised him earlier to make the point to illustrate how resistant the Cleveland Police Agency and City Hall are to using other models or input from outside, or looking at best practices and trying to implement them here. But no, I don't agree with his position at this point where he is now. I think what has happened, he's somewhat, I guess, in the parlance of the Black Power movement, he's been co-opted. You know, he's been engaged with the police so long, and now it's about money. There's a cottage industry that develops as well. So some people get into it and start chasing dollars and aren't really committed to really affecting the change that they initially signed on to. My point is, I don't agree with his comments relative to the significance or lack thereof of race in these issues, nor his comments. He did suggest that Michelle Alexander was misguided with her work. Yes.
I think your piece was eloquently put, but I think what was missing, as I honestly will say, is that there's a homogeny happening, and the homogeny is like cities aren't looked at as communities anymore. They're looked at as markets. There's a market for those tickets. You said earlier there were 12,000 something tickets in the city of Shaker. There's a market for that. There's a market for you said it's vital to have your driver's license, but the market doesn't care about that. So this whole thing about people getting pulled over and not have a license, generating revenue, is for the addiction of profit. So how else are these lawyers and judges, how else are they going to get their retirement and their pension if they don't feed this addiction to profit? We live in a society where people on Wall Street balance their books depending on how many people are going to go to jail that year. I mean, that's sick. There's an addiction to profit. So I think what's missing out of that piece is addressing the issue of addiction. Police officers, they have power, but they want more and more. So they abuse their authority. So what
would you suggest?
So you tell me, when you mentioned addressing the overall demographics of various cities and various states, you have to look at addiction. So to actually reevaluate, how do we define authority? What is authority? Well, how do you define that? And when you can honestly define what authority is the truth. That's the authority.
How do we achieve what you would see as being the desired outcome or objective? How do we get to what you're...
To honestly be able to say what the problems are. As I just stated before, there's a market for disadvantaged people being disenfranchised, so these tickets can be paid for. There is a market in the city of Cleveland and East Cleveland for drugs. There's a market there for that. Cities aren't looked at as communities, they're looked at as markets. There's a homogeny happening.
Okay.
So with that said, how can you not look at foreclosures? The city of East Cleveland, large parts of Cleveland, there's the foreclosures. The banks had a lot to do with that.
I have the data in my office.
So what is that? What is that addressing?
On the east side
what
of
is that
the city
addressing?
and
That's
county.
addressing addiction for profit by any means necessary, regardless of the social and environmental cost. So if you're not looking at that, if you're just saying, okay, well, black people are getting pulled over here, white people are getting pulled over less, how's that addressing a real quote unquote problem?
How do you address it? Wholesale. How do you address it? We have to, I work incrementally, okay? As I said, I've done research on other parts of the criminal justice continuum. I'm trying to do my part to dismantle this unjust monster, or Leviathan, if you will, that people have been caught up in. I'm doing what I can to illuminate and offer some solutions, some applicable, practical solutions.
No disrespect to you. I applaud you for what you're doing. But at the same time, if you notice, I don't know if it's just me, but there's a lot of different talks. This week there's a talk on police brutality. The next week there's a lot of different talks and addressing various different issues. But you ever notice there's not one commitment made to addressing one issue? There's a lot of talks on various different issues.
I have to disagree
No.
with you
What I
there.
mean is there's not one commitment. There's not going to say, okay, we're going to accomplish this month and that's it. We're going to address this issue and nothing else. And we're going to, after we finish this, we're going to move on to address something else. That doesn't happen. Can you tell me why it's like people are getting split off in 20 different directions, nothing ever gets accomplished? We talk a good game, we talk a good stuff, we put it up on screen so we can look at the demographics, but other than that, nothing happens. Why is that?
You know what? Let me share this with you. I've been engaged in this. I told you, this stemmed from my dissertation research, initially, the initial study. But I've been doing research in this area. I mentioned knowing Cedric back in '95, and I had to tell them at that time, look, fellas, I'm with you in spirit, but I need to go and get this degree, get this education, so we can be scientific about it. I've been directly engaged in this type of research for 17 years. Now, others, they might, and I've seen exactly what you described. People, they have short attention spans. I've been at this 17 years. Now everybody is convening meetings. Everybody wants to be, leading a group. There are more groups than you can shake a stick at, engaged on this now that DOJ has come in, But the thing is, I can control me and what I do and what part of the solution I play or bring to the table. You see, but I've stayed focused. I've stayed committed. Janice, you've known me for years. People probably thought I felt like John the Baptist, for those of you that, biblical scholars, out in the wilderness singing this very same thing. As I mentioned, the task force that I've been appointed to by Governor Kasich, it was my idea. But I stayed persistent. I had suggested to Senator Turner and Senator Williams before the election that there was a need to have something when Kasich was on the campaign trail and Fitzgerald's campaign imploded. I suggested to them then, put out the call for a commission on statewide policing. Why? Because as I cited, all of the major urban areas across the state that have come under DOJ guidance. Now, mind you, that was before DOJ came back to town. I put it out out then, but it was only after DOJ that they then, and the death of Tremere Rice and Tanisha Anderson, these recent deaths, that they then acted upon it and took it to the governor, and then he reluctantly, but ultimately did adopt it. So I'm saying all that to say, other people might, have short attention spans and not be focused on one specific thing, getting one thing accomplished. But I know personally, myself and Dr. Rhonda, we're engaged in some efforts and initiatives that aren't operating that way, that are getting things done. There are people that are engaged and staying engaged and have been engaged a long time. Now, the powers to be, those that are in a position to change things like that, for whatever reason, they aren't willing. They don't have the political will or the courage. And that's where it takes us to help create that will. And that's why I say I'm so optimistic and heartened by these young people that are going down there in City Hall during council meeting, disrupting the meeting. I was teaching class on the first Monday night that they did their protest in council. And a colleague from the ACLU sent me a text, and I'm at the lectern teaching. And during the break, I saw it, and I just said, okay, cool. She had sent me a video. I said, okay, cool. And then, the next day, she responded. She said, no, Ronnie, they were making demands based off of your research, the study I had done on the Civilian Review Board.
And actually, one of those students was here tonight who actually ended up on the front page of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Yeah. But I want to just interject two things here and then pass the mic to Tim. And that is the questions and the conversation that we've been having here requires that we think about two things. One is, I think, Ronnie, you touched on it, is that the kind of changes that we're seeking are not going to just happen overnight. That's not to say we shouldn't be pushing for things to happen quickly and expeditiously, but it also means that some of the nitty-gritty transformation of policy and legislation, and I'm gonna say transformation, not reform, transformation of policy and legislation, and other kinds of transformations in terms of economic systems takes people who are going to stay in it in the long haul, even if you take some breaks, because all of us need some mental health breaks and some self-care breaks or whatever. But we got to stay in it in the long haul. And the other thing is that there are people engaged all the time, and we don't know that people are engaged. Just like most of us don't know, maybe I shouldn't say most of us, many of us don't know the history that's even behind the systems that we're fighting, enough to know what pieces of the system we should be fighting in the first place and how they continue to perpetuate and manifest themselves. So it's incumbent upon us to also get ourselves up to speed, understand who's in the fight, understand how people are trying to fight, and where we can fill the gaps as well as support those initiatives that we think are important. The other thing that I think is important too is to think about how we change the terminology, which is to your point about what do we even call, for instance, welfare? What do we call addiction? How do we talk about power and authority? And to the degree that we can begin to introduce some of those conversations to push at the edges of what people's familiar ideas are and assumptions that feed into myths and stereotypes about who has control, who has power, who's at the behest of the system, all of those things, then we can begin to shift the conversation in a different kind of way too. Because when I first heard you talking about addiction, I thought you were automatically talking about something else. But the whole idea of how we think about addiction in relationship to power, in relationship to money, in relationship to wealth is another kind of conversation that also helps us to explode the notion that when we think about addiction, we have this stereotype of who it is we think are addicted, and therefore who should be criminalized, and therefore who are the predators and all of those kinds of things. And so I think thinking about terminology, which is something some of us don't want to do because we think it's abstract and think it's not worth our time, the logics and the governing mentalities that we have are driven by language, and language actually becomes real and embedded in policy and the way that we treat each other in material reality. So I think all of these things are very, very important, and the ways in which we are actually able to draw on the kinds of statistics, the kinds of research, and the action on the street, and see this as a continuum of activism and a continuum of struggle that we all need to be engaged in. We all have our specific places, but not to denigrate and put people down for the specific things they do, as long as it's a progressive, socially transformative part of the movement that they're trying to engage in and help us to progress in. So, I mean, I think this conversation in and of itself points out so many different things that I just wanted to kind of make us think about a little bit more deeply as we move to the next question, which is Tim. We'll take maybe 2 more questions after that, and then we'll close it out.
Well, this is really sort of a follow-up to what Rhonda actually just said. But first of all, thanks a lot for your comments and your work on reform. As someone who works in the criminal justice system, I mean, I think of the police as a small part of a larger system of control, and that's out of control, right? I mean, I wonder if we could even use the term police state now. I mean, when we have 1 out of every 31 adults in the United States who are under some form of criminal justice control or management, parole, probation, jails, prisons, and so on. So it seems like, you know, we can dig in here, and we have to dig in here. We have a crisis here. We got to work on reform here. But the question is, how do we link up? I mean, in some ways, I mean, we could think about this. If we think about just the numbers of people who we're hiring for guard labor, right, in the prisons, probation officers. I mean, our criminal justice schools are turning them out right and left, right?
Yes.
And what are we doing? We're hiring people to do something that's impossible, and that is to control the lives of people who don't want to be controlled. So we're creating structurally a situation of conflict and chaos, right? And so we're trying to deal with that in the corners where we can deal with it, but it's a larger systemic problem. And it does get back to what this young man here is saying in terms of you know, we have a late stage capitalist system that has created this problem. And so, you know, I guess the question is, can we do this work without being anti-capitalist, or at least being reform capitalists? I mean, we have to deal with this broader problem because these things are linked. So.
Yes, and I can fully appreciate, and I didn't mean to be dismissive to the young man, the brother's comments, and I understand, and that's what I was wondering, was this really just a critique of capitalism? I believe we're compelled to work within the system within which we find ourselves. Now, are there broader economic activities and things that need to be addressed? Yes, absolutely. This is an economic system. This system is thriving off a certain segment of the population. Jobs are dependent upon this system operating the way it does. This is just part of the prison industrial complex. This is the lead filter into the funnel, into that system. And that's why, once again, I go to the front end of it to try to stave off or turn off that spigot, or at least close down that funnel that's filtering people into that system unjustly. Now, do we need this the prison system? Absolutely. Do we need police? Yes, absolutely. Or else we'd have anarchy. We'd have total chaos. Are there some people that need to be incarcerated? Yes, there are. My research, my argument is not an anti-policing argument or any of that. I'm trying to work within the system that we find ourselves to reform it and make it just and equitable. And all of those principles that Dr. King and so many others fought and died for, trying to continue that work. It's not, well, our ancestors, what did they, I mean, the hope of the slaves, what did they have, what rationally would have told them that they would one day be free? You see my point? The hope and dreams of the slaves. It seemed impossible for our ancestors, but we are, technically, I guess you would say, in theory, we're free. So.
You had mentioned earlier some progress that has happened as far as reentry is concerned. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, Governor Kasich signed House Bill, what is it, 3? Someone help me, anyone? It's called the Collateral Sanctions Bill. This has been about 2 years ago. It was designed to reduce some of the barriers to reentry. For example, I made reference to the driving under suspension issue and how that impedes employment. Well, in the state of Ohio, there are 47 offenses for which a person license can be suspended that have no relation to your driving at all. Any drug conviction, a minor drug conviction, your license can be suspended anywhere from 6 months up to 5 years. So those are some of the reforms that were made under that bill, and they have some certificate that returning citizens can obtain to show employers that they've been through this certain training, and in essence, they aren't a risk as far as hiring for employment purposes and insurance risk. There are some other things in the bill, but those are some of the things it was intended to do, reduce some of the barriers and collateral sanctions that impede people reentering the community successfully.
My question is, what type of society, this is the question I've always asked myself, what type of society do we really want? You know, what type of society produces this type of disparity, this type of for lack of a better term, this type of it's really anarchy in the sense under the notion of chaos. I mean, under the notion of order, because if you look at it, you know, critically, as Dr. Runner was speaking about, it's the broader question is, you know, do we want this type of society that we find ourselves in? And the way it's been created, like, for instance, mass incarceration, when you have recidivism where the people are constantly going in a revolving door and they're coming out with that prison culture, and you're bringing them out and mixing them into the regular citizenry, and all the disparities and all the type of mentalities that go along with incarcerating people, and you dump them back out here without jobs, I mean, you're really creating a society that you cannot sustain. But to zero in more on your data and your research, you know, just recently, within the last couple of days, there was a study out that showed that, and it was quite an extensive conversation about police have quotas to ticket people. And if they don't meet their quotas, you know, the department that they work for is under a certain amount of quotas to receive grants from different agencies, government, what have you. And they can't receive those grants. And I was shocked to know that these departments are under such strenuous that you must go out and get 50 tickets and so forth. Otherwise, we won't qualify for this grant money. And I'm like, that's unbelievable. But, you know, Ronnie, I am grateful for the work that you have done, because I remember when you first published your first, you know, the one that you did for your dissertation. And that was I mean, it changed a lot of conversation, it changed a lot of thought. So I'm just asking those basic questions. Do we want this type of society that we find ourselves up under, that we're creating, and is steadily manifesting all these abnormal psychological dysfunctions?
Yes, yes. To answer your question, Cedric, I would say no, we don't want the type of society we find ourselves under. That's why, we're doing the work and the advocacy and the things that we are doing to help try to transform it. Maybe I'm being idealistic, but I think we are at a transformative moment in this country. Not only in this country, but here in Cleveland. We have an excellent opportunity to transform things. I was sharing with Dr. Rhonda the other Saturday, we had met, and God knows, we normally on Saturdays, we meet, and then we have a meeting after the meeting, and it was one of those long days we had been meeting, and I'm working on a book, writing the history of school desegregation in the urban north, and using the Cleveland school desegregation case as a case study to talk about that process. And we're interviewing some of the people that were involved during that time period, and we had conducted an interview with Congressman Stokes. It's a priceless interview, about 3 hours in length, and I had gotten the transcript, and I was at home writing on my computer, and I was writing about his family and his brother and the Huff riots and that piece, and how Carl Stokes acknowledged the fact that those riots actually helped facilitate his being elected mayor. And it struck me when I read that again, and I was aware of it, but at that point something said, wait a minute, we're in another one of those moments, those transformative moments, where the business community is paying attention and they want to see the necessary changes taking place, because they don't want the good things that have been accruing to Cleveland as of late to dissipate. They don't want to lose that. So the economic interests in this city are willing to do what's necessary to make sure that the necessary changes take place. So I called Dr. Rhonda to share that with her, and I couldn't get her, because it was like this light went on, like, wait a minute, we need to really appreciate the opportunity that we have at this point. Now, the fact that DOJ is in here, ultimately, I know that, there's been some resistance on the part of some public officials, but ultimately, if you look at the history of these type of situations across the nation where DOJ has come in, they're going to rule the day, obviously. I mean, the mayor of Seattle tried to fight against the Department of Justice, and I think it was his law director said that's equivalent to taking on the largest law firm in the world. It's a no-win proposition. So ultimately, I think we're going to see change here at the local level. Once again, things are happening at the state level. With all of the publicity that the governor has given this task force politically, and he's even, obviously there's some considerations possibly being made of possibly running for the White House. It wouldn't be to his political advantage for nothing to come out of the work of this task force. Something has to come out of it, of some substance, or else, how's that going to look on him? You see? So, and then, as I said, there's a need for something to be done at the county level. So, maybe I'm just being idealistic or naive or whatever, but I'm cautiously optimistic. Well, hey, I got to have a dream, I got to have a dream.
So, I want to bring us to a closure with a few comments. I want to thank Ronnie Dunn again. I want to thank all of you for staying as long as you have, and the questions and both the provocative and prolific conversation and discussion that we've had. But I want to sort of end with the last quote that I started with the presentation in terms of introducing Dr. Dunn, and then just raise up a couple points. And that quote is from James Baldwin. So I just want to read it again. Precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience, you must find yourself at war with your society. And I think those words are prophetic and in operation right now if we actually heed them. And that is the conversation that we've been having is a conversation about what kinds of immediate changes need to take place, what kinds of things we need to learn and know so that we can make informed decisions and engage in a struggle that is not just informed solely by passions and emotion, which need to stay in the midst of it all, but also needs to be informed by information and strategy and tactics. But it also requires that we not only think about reform, but we think about transformation. I really do distinguish between those two things in my head, and to think about root causes, and to think about the holistic system that we find ourselves in, or think about a system and the holistic transformation that we want to see in terms of the system that we find ourselves in. So what does it mean to get at the root causes? What does it mean to get at the systems and the structures? What does it mean to think about politics and economics and social relationships? What would it take to create the kind of society we want to live in, and what kind of society do we want to live in, and what kind of human beings do we want to be? It is the motto, it is what drives us at the Social Justice Institute. And so these kinds of conversations are beginning points, and then we need to continuously dig deeper, and we need to continuously think about what are the systems and the structures that are propped up that continue to create oppression over and over and over again, even as we have to begin to change things in the meantime so that people's trauma and pain and exclusion are addressed, right? And so for me, it's about all of what Dr. Dunn said. It's about the points that people raised, and it's about us thinking about what ultimately are the things that we have to begin to transform if we're actually going to bring about a society that actually uplifts human dignity and respect and equity, and brings about equity and justice and a different kind of social relationships. And so I'm gonna leave it with that and say the questions that you all raise are good questions. The conversation has been a good conversation. I hope you will return for the next teaching that we have on March 4th, where we will be talking about millennials and student radicalism, and what does that mean in terms of having a radical politics. And I would also ask if you could please fill out your form that we passed out, the questionnaire that we have, what other kind of information do you want to see us deal with, how did you find the session, all of those kinds of things that help us with the work that we do. But please, and sign in. Allison is up here pointing to me. Please sign in before you leave out. Precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience, you must find yourself at war with your society. So we have to keep up the struggle on all levels and work to transform the conditions, not only ourselves, but those who have the least among us. That requires some revolutionary thinking and some radical change. Thank you very much for coming.